You've spoken favorably in these lectures about the right to freedom of speech and other human rights, but I take it you would not assent to the usual list of rights so much publicized these days, such as the right to a minimum standard of living, the right to equality of opportunity, the right to a free education, and so on. Distinction. That is the fundamental question that I'm really asking, that's at the bottom of this, is what is a right? Can you define the term right in such a way as to make a distinction like this clear?
Yes, certainly. A right is a moral concept applicable only in a social context. His rights, that is that which he may or may not do in relation to other men, that which he may or may not do in society, has to be derived from what does man's nature require for his proper survival. First of all, that he use his reason. It requires that he make his perception of reality, the basic virtue, and that he act on the rational judgment of his own mind. There is no way for him to survive, provide even his simplest needs without some process of thought. Therefore, when he deals with others, those conditions which are required for the proper survival of every individual man, every member, that which is required for his proper survival constitutes his rights. By his nature, man has to support his own life by his own effort. Since survival is not provided to him automatically, man, by his nature, has to work for his own survival. His life depends on his own action. And in order to survive, he has to have the right to his own life. He should be free to choose his own values and then pursue and achieve these values if he can, and that is the right to the pursuit of happiness. And since man is not a ghost, but an integrated entity which has consciousness and matter, in order to survive, man needs material property. He has to support his life by means of the product of his own effort. Therefore, he has the right of property, the right to work for his own values, for his own survival, and to keep the product, the result of his work. I reject that the source of rights is social, that rights are privileges or gifts of society. If rights inhere in society, then an individual man exists not by right but by permission. Since he has no right to life, then society permits him to exist or may revoke that permission anytime it chooses. Therefore, the social source of right is really total denial of rights, because then man does not act on right but on permission.
Would you say, Ms. Rand, that government has no rights?
Government as such, none. Because after all, government is an institution. Now the officials are men, and they cannot have any right different from those of every other individual. All rights necessarily have to be universal, in the sense that if they are derived from the necessity and the facts of human nature, they would pertain equally to all men. The government has only a delegated right, but by itself, it can have no rights. Now, shall I answer the first part of your question about why I would not recognize the right to minimum sustenance? Well, there, you have a complete contradiction. This concept of rights demands values which do not, in fact, belong to men in nature. In other words, the right to a minimum sustenance means that a man without any effort on his part is entitled to sustain his life. Well, since nature does not provide men automatically with this sustenance, the only way of maintaining or implementing such a right would be to breach, infringe, and deny the rights of some other man. It means that some other man is charged with the unchosen responsibility to support the man who is guaranteed a minimum sustenance. It means that some men are to be enslaved to the minimum or maximum needs of others. Not only is it a vicious concept, it cannot possibly be called a right. Nobody could, in fact, maintain the right of some men to enslave others and to demand from them the unearned. The sense in which I use that survival does not apply to the range of the immediate moment. It is survival across the whole span of a human life. The brute physical survival of the moment as a standard usually ends with that moment, that it is one of the most disastrous policies that a man can accept. At no time can man hold the immediate advantage or survival of any one issue or any one moment above his knowledge of the long-range cost. A rational being does not live like an animal on the range of the immediate moment. This is precisely what man's proper survival forbids. Now, when you say that if we do not support certain people, they will die, this is not metaphysically an issue open to our choice. Such is man's nature and man's position on earth, that if he does not provide for his survival, nature will not take care of him. Since this is so, the universal, rational law of morality applicable here is that every man is responsible for his own survival and that he cannot become a mortgage on the life of another man. That to have the right of life does not mean that someone else has to lose his right and spend his existence supporting you. The confusion here is between the right itself and the content or the consequence and result of that right. For instance, if you have the right to live, that means you have the right to work and produce the material goods of your survival. It doesn't mean that somebody else has to produce the result of your right and provide you with food.
I'm thinking now not so much of the people who are able to engage in productive labor but won't, as of the people who are handicapped and cannot, by their own nature, provide anything at all for themselves.
Well, in that case, and by the very definition, they can survive only by the assistance of those people who are able to help them. They cannot make their need a mortgage or a burden on the man without whom their own survival is not possible. If anyone were sincerely concerned with the plight of the handicapped, one should leave the strong, the productive, the able men free, because they're the only ones who can provide for the handicapped. A right has to be based on nature.
What would happen if we had a system of complete laissez-faire capitalism, except for one detail, namely, that there would be a state subsidy in the form of relief for the poor? What then?
Well, what would happen is exactly what is happening today. The answer here does not need to be too theoretical. You can see it in practice. If you established this kind of law institution, it amounts to establishing the principle of collectivism and altruism. By passing that law, you have, in effect, based that law on the idea that some men have the right to claim an unearned support from others who have to assume that responsibility whether they choose it or not. This is the principle which makes a man's life, liberty, and property subject to the will of society. There is no other base on which one could justify this law. And if one did so, one would not be able to stop the process until the whole of society collapsed into totalitarian collectivism. The idea of public relief and of supporting the needy at public expense was started in 1933 by the Roosevelt administration. At that time, the claim of those who advocated was that we have to help temporarily in an emergency just the 1/3 of our own nation, which, according to Mr. Roosevelt, was ill-fed, ill-clothed, and materially underprivileged, whichever he meant. Now, that was certainly a very evil, very improper, altruist, collectivist premise, but let us assume that people accept it. And people accept it mainly because they might think that here we are one nation and a rather wealthy nation, and it's our own citizens. I think most people accepted that idea on precisely that kind of superficial reasoning, but kindness. A principle is an absolute that permits no exception, and you cannot, out of charity, sympathy, or any other reason, introduce an evil principle into society and put it over on people by governmental force, by law.
What should we have done in 1933? Let all these people starve? I take it a point you would wish to emphasize is that had there not been all the governmental meddling in the economy in the first place, no such crisis as that of 29 of 33 would have occurred in the first place.
Exactly. All depressions are the result of government interference in the economy, and the depression of 1929 in particular was due to the fiscal credit policies of the Federal Reserve Bank. It was caused by the government, and the thing to do was to decontrol as rapidly as one could. Only there weren't enough thinkers and statesmen at that time to propose such a plan.
Nevertheless, one might ask, since government has caused the disease is there. Doesn't it require government action to cure it?
This really means that if you have a deadly disease and you have germs in your system which are killing you, shouldn't you then take a stronger dose of the same poison, introduce more germs, more virulent germs into your system in order to cure it? Obviously not. It is not government action that is required, but the repeal of government powers. If you have social problems or economic troubles in a society, just as in medicine or any other field, you should first of all, before you attempt a cure, discover the cause. And if you discover that the cause is a long series of government controls, the only cure possible is to start decontrolling and removing, one by one, the chains, the causes which led to this particular trouble or problem.
Do you think thousands of people in the United States might have starved during the process of decontrol, which would have lasted several years at any rate?
No, certainly not. To begin with, they were not starving. The United States has never yet known what starvation really is, if you talk in terms of comparison to Europe and the rest of the world. Private charity is what would have taken care of any actual acute need. But above all, what was needed was more jobs. In order to have more jobs, you set free the men who are able to create jobs, the businessmen, the industrialists, the financiers. You leave men free to create jobs. You do not change them at a time when you need them most. And in fact, morally, you never change them.